Hello, everyone. Welcome to our briefing on the current protests in India. My name is Mary Chapman. I'm Manager of Client Communications at WorldAware, and I'll be moderating today's briefing. All attendees will be muted throughout the briefing. Please hold all questions until the end. This briefing is being recorded and will be provided to attendees after the call. Our first speaker is Brendan O'Reilly. Brendan is an intelligence analyst for WorldAware's Asia Regional team. He's going to discuss the background of the Indian Citizenship Bill, the different motivations behind the protests, and potential future developments. Brendan?
Thank you, Mary. As I'm sure everyone is aware, the recently passed Citizenship Amendment Act has prompted significant protests in many areas of India over the last few days especially, although the protests really started picking up steam in the far northeast of India from around December 4th. The controversial Citizenship Amendment Act passed in the Indian Parliament on December 11th. But something important to keep in mind is that the act has not been notified yet. What this means is that the act is law, but the government has not actually implemented the provisions of the act, although it could do so at any time. As I mentioned before, the protests they started in the far northeast of India, and they have been generally the most disruptive in the far northeast of India, although we have seen major disruptions in other parts of the country, especially from December 15th. Now, in order to understand why this bill is so controversial and the protests that are related to it, of course, we're going to need to discuss the Citizenship Amendment Act itself. What the Act does is that it provides an easier path to Indian citizenship for religious minorities, specifically Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Zoroastrians, and Christians, from the countries of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, provided the individuals were present in India prior to December 31st, 2014. What this basically means is that people who were in India who are of these religious minorities from those neighboring countries would be able to acquire Indian citizenship more easily once the act is notified. As I mentioned before, it has been passed into law, but the government has not started enforcing it yet. Now, the Indian government, led by the Bharatiya Janata Party, has cited humanitarian concerns when bringing about this act, saying that it is necessary because those religious minorities in predominantly Muslim countries face religious discrimination and persecution. At the same time, of course, there are likely political motives at play. The Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, is ideologically Hindu nationalist, and this act helps them to enforce their narrative of helping oppressed Hindus in the region, especially. When talking about opposition to the Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA, there's basically two schools of thought that are driving opposition in various parts of India. First of all, the act is controversial because of who is left out. Obviously, the act explicitly does not apply to Muslims from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. So there is lots of opposition to the act because it is perceived as discriminatory and even unconstitutional, according to many of its critics. At the same time, other groups that have faced persecution in the region, such as Sri Lankan Tamils, obviously there was a lot of controversy related to the long-running civil war in Sri Lanka. There are at least 100,000 or so Sri Lankan Tamils who are currently present in India, essentially as refugees, and the act does not help them out in terms of acquiring Indian citizenship. There are also fears that the Indian government might try to implement a national registry of citizens, which would basically prevent people, or, according to many, it could be used discriminatorily and deny citizenship to lots of residents of India. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the protests have been especially intense and disruptive in the far northeast of India. Now, in the far northeast of India, people are not opposing the act so much because of who is being left out, but rather who is being left in. There's a major and long-standing fear in this region of migration, especially from Bangladesh. There are likely millions of Bangladeshi migrants in this far northeast region, and people fear that this act will facilitate increased Bangladeshi migration into the area. It's important to understand that the far northeast of India, many people there have felt marginalized and kind of separated from the Indian mainstream, essentially since Indian independence in 1947. As you can see from the map, this part of India is connected to the rest of India, but only through a very narrow gap, essentially, between Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. So this region already felt economically, socially, and culturally marginalized, and many groups, as I said, are afraid that an increase of Bangladeshi migration to the region will essentially undermine their native cultures. And this region, it's important to understand, has experienced very disruptive protests in recent weeks against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And there have been widespread transportation disruptions and business disruptions in the region. And something that we're looking out for is a potential increase in ethnic separatist militant activity. There are several armed insurgent groups that are active in the region, and it's possible they may increase their activities against the Indian government to show opposition to the Citizenship Amendment Act. Specifically, what I'm talking about here are likely relatively minor shooting, bomb or grenade attacks, likely on Indian security force personnel. Now, while the largest and most disruptive protests have been concentrated in the far northeast, especially in the state of Assam, in recent days, especially from around December 15th, we also have seen major protests in other parts of the country. So these protests have largely been driven by Muslim groups, specifically Muslim students in many areas, especially in Delhi. They are opposed to the act, again, because of its discriminatory nature. And in addition to those groups, there are many opposition parties, especially in Kerala state, West Bengal, and parts of Bihar, who have held major protests against the act, kind of as a way of showing, well, for one, because they're ideologically opposed to the act, but also it's likely that they're seizing on this controversy in order to show their opposition to the BJP-led central government. In terms of where these protests have been most well attended and most disruptive, as of now it has been in parts of Delhi, especially in northeast Delhi, several locations in Uttar Pradesh state, parts of West Bengal, and there also have been some fairly disruptive shutdown strikes in Kerala and also in Bihar state. Now, when we're talking about the disruptions associated with these protests, there have been fairly major transport disruptions and business disruptions, especially in areas where people have held shutdown strikes or bans. These are actions in which generally a political group will call for all businesses and transport operations to close in a specific area at a specific time. Obviously, in addition to this, you have more localized transport and business disruptions from large protests in which people march along streets or block roadways. We've seen some rail blockades as well, especially in parts of West Bengal and Assam. And there have also been some clashes in recent days between police and protesters, and between, in some areas, between rival groups of protesters who are supporting the bill and protesters who are against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And also in terms of disruptions, it's important to understand that disruptions are not only being caused by protesters themselves, but sometimes the official reaction to the protests can cause disruptions. We've seen in recent days, especially localized internet and telecom shutdowns in some areas where disruptive protests have occurred. When talking about key inflection points going forward, there are some political developments and on-the-ground developments that could see these protests either start to decrease or perhaps intensify. It's possible that the Citizenship Amendment Act could be overturned in court. Already the act is being challenged in the Indian judicial system. It's possible there might be some sort of ruling regarding the act in late January. Obviously, if the act is overturned in the courts, that would lead to a decrease in the protests against it. However, if the act were to be overturned, it's likely that there would be at least some level of increased counter demonstrations by groups who support the act. Another factor to keep in mind here is there's a possibility of significant clashes between groups who support the act and groups who are opposed to the act. And given the religiously charged nature of the act, it's possible this could take the form of significant clashes essentially between groups of Muslims and Hindus. If this happens in India, these types of disruptions and confrontations can get very violent very quickly and potentially spread to other areas. So far, we haven't seen this playing out significantly, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. A national registry of citizens, if the government goes ahead and implements this, as some government leaders have said they intend to do, that would likely be highly controversial and would likely see protests intensify or perhaps restart if the protests die down in the meantime. A final piece to keep in mind here, although this is not on the PowerPoint, is that, as I mentioned earlier, the act has passed, but it has not been notified, which is to say, again, that the government hasn't started enforcing this act. If the government does notify the act and begins to enforce it, it's likely you would see at least a marginal increase in protests and protest-related disruptions.
Thank you, Brendan. Next, we'll be hearing from Tony Rocafort. Tony is a senior security advisor with WorldAware's Global Assistance and Response Team. He's going to discuss the current security recommendations for organizations operating in India. Tony?
All right. Thanks, Mary and Brendan. I'll be brief. When dealing with any kind of civil unrest, we want to be as proactive as possible and keep as much distance between us and the demonstrations as possible. If we find ourselves in the vicinity of a protest that turns violent, we're forced into reactive mode where the potential for seriously negative cascading effects is high. So avoidance is the goal here. Clients with interests in India, particularly in the Northeast, need to maintain situational awareness at all times, keep up to date on the current and upcoming protest locations, roadblocks, and as Brendan mentioned, any impending strikes that could lead to major service disruptions. So ensure that all stakeholders are reading WorldAware's alerts, studying the attached maps, liaising with WorldAware through the Access to Analysts program, communicating with trusted local contacts, monitoring all your internal message traffic, conducting regular check calls with internal emergency response teams, assuming you have them in place. That'll all help ensure you have an accurate depiction of the situation on the ground. Organizations in the impacted areas should also consider implementing a work from home or a work from hotel policy. Obviously, that involves ensuring that you have contracts in place with the hotels and residential building managers in the facilities that you occupy to ensure that you have guaranteed access to the living and working space that you require. Organizations who are considering some kind of work from home or work from hotel policy should also ensure personnel are adequately equipped with multiple forms of communication, remote access capability, and backup power supplies, as well as food, water, medication, and hygiene supplies in the event of a prolonged shelter in place is required. If you haven't already done so, develop a robust communications plan to ensure that you can gain rapid accountability of all personnel in India, particularly those operating in the northeastern region, if the situation deteriorates. Remember the acronym PACE: primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. Redundancy is vital to all aspects of a security plan, but especially so when critical aspects of that plan involve electronic devices. So when we're talking primary communications, we're looking at email and landlines. Alternate, we're looking at cell phones with the WorldQ mobile app or critical track, SMS, text, regional HF or VHF or UHF radios. Contingency comms can be two-way satellite communications, and emergency comms can be one-way satellite communications. Those personal locator beacons or those one-way text page satellite text pagers. As an alternate emergency, we can have designated communications windows for safety check-ins, and then clear escalation procedures for when those designated communication windows are missed, to include mechanisms to conduct face-to-face wellness checks and thresholds for activating emergency contact notification procedures. With that being said, you need to make sure you know exactly where all your people are located, in case you need to steer assets to their location or coordinate some kind of evacuation on their behalf. Don't rely on an itinerary that was submitted 6 months ago. Confirm that your people are still where they said they would be. Also have your people, especially those in the Northeast, pack a go bag now. Go bags need to have all key identification, important contact information, and travel documents. Go bags should have credit cards and cash, ideally enough to sustain your people for at least 96 hours. Any required medication with their physician's prescription. A few other items to consider: extra communications devices, power supplies, high energy snacks, bottled water, water treatment, a flashlight with extra batteries, a small hygiene kit, a small first aid kit, and rain gear. Once a go bag is packed, leave it packed, but make sure your people are keeping all backup communications devices and power supplies fully charged. If you must relocate or if you have plans to head to the airport, try and move in groups of at least 4 people. Have multiple routes mapped out and memorized ahead of time, ideally circumventing the known hotspots in the city in case you hit some kind of choke point. And track your location at all times. Stay in constant contact with your security team as you're moving. If you have the WorldQ mobile app or critical track on your phone, consider using the check-in functions as you're moving so response coordinators can track your progress en route. That'll make things go a bit smoother in case response assets need to be spun up on your behalf in an emergency. Ensure your people are bracing for an increased security posture in the region as well. Minimize nighttime movement and prepare for additional curfews in many major cities, particularly in the Northeast. As such, ensure that, if you are moving throughout the city or especially if you're commuting to the airport, make sure you're allowing for additional travel time. If confronted by security forces for whatever reason, comply with all instructions immediately and do not attempt to bypass a security cordon for any reason. Even an accidental breach of a security cordon, especially near a protest site or where there's a curfew being enforced, may prompt security forces to respond aggressively. When traveling through any airport in the region, don't linger in the public areas. Get out of the public spaces, the check-in kiosks, rental car facilities, taxi stands, baggage claim, etc., as fast as possible. On the departure side, you want to get behind the security gates as fast as possible. On the arrival side, make sure you have a detailed reception plan in place to minimize the time spent in exposed areas. So ensure the precise link up location, the name, contact information, the photo of your driver, as well as the make, model, and tag number of their vehicle is communicated well in advance of any travel to the region. Moving on, when you're traveling through the region, either on foot or in a vehicle, ensure that you're planning, memorizing, and utilizing multiple routes. As always, there are no shortages of stressors that could disrupt travel plans. So ensuring that we know where we are at all times, where we need to go, and having multiple ways to get there will help mitigate vulnerabilities during transit. If we're maintaining situational awareness and we understand the layout of the region, we can plan routes that circumvent common flashpoints or protest sites or other choke point areas. So again, study local maps, make mental notes of alternate routes, as well as possible safe havens along each route. However, we want to avoid lingering near security checkpoints or cordons, as well as near government buildings, as these could obviously be targets of protest violence. A quick note on safe havens. Understanding that this is not always possible. The ideal safe haven is a location that's open 24 hours a day. So we're looking at hotels, hospitals, public transportation depots if need be. The idea is to allow us to arrive without any kind of time restriction and to loiter for long periods while we attempt to coordinate secure transport back to our home, our hotel, or our office. If possible, look for locations that have multiple points of ingress and egress along 2 or more routes, along 2 or more side streets. Proximity to mass transportation is also ideal so that personnel can make a hasty exit prior to link up time if the situation worsens in their immediate area. If you happen to be caught up in a protest, attempt to detach yourself from the group without drawing attention to yourself. Keep a low profile by mimicking the actions of the group while simultaneously moving to the rear or outer edge of the crowd. Exit as quickly as possible down a side street or into a shop. Remember though, try to avoid government buildings and police stations and checkpoints. If you find yourself in the vicinity of a major clash and you happen to come into contact with any riot control agents, make sure you're moving into the wind. Do your best to distance yourself from nearby demonstrators. Continue moving into the wind until you reach fresh air and flush your eyes with clean water for at least 15 minutes. If you're wearing contacts, remove them and don't reinsert them. Remove any contaminated clothing, but try to avoid pulling your shirts or your coats over your head. Wash contaminated skin, eyeglasses with soap and water, but do not use oil-based solutions or solutions that contain bleach. Contaminated clothing should be discarded or thoroughly washed several times with cold water. And then obviously seek medical attention if breathing difficulties or eye or skin irritation persists. With that, I'll wrap up and hand it back to Mary. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tony. We're now going to begin the QA portion of the call. As a reminder, you can submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. The first question we have is that you mentioned a threat of possible increased militancy by separatist groups in Northeast Asia. What techniques can people use to mitigate their exposure to these threats if they are in that region?
Sure. If you find yourself in the vicinity of a bombing, a gunfight, or some kind of active assailant or hostile event, pick your favorite nightmare, yeah. Your immediate objective is to create space between you and the threat. You need to get off the X, as we call it, as quickly as possible. Remember, run, hide, fight, or avoid, barricade, confront. Assess the situation, make a plan, move in the opposite direction of the assailant. Move as far away from the threat zone as possible, get to a covered position as quickly as possible. Make sure you understand the difference between cover and concealment, right? Cover stops bullets and fragmentation. Concealment only screens your view from, or only screens you from view. If you're moving away from the assailant, keep your hands up, your fingers open, so responding forces know that you're not a threat. Remain quiet and calm, and and don't ask responders for assistance. Remember, in any kind of active scenario, the armed security personnel responding are often laser focused on neutralizing the threat. So they can't escort every single person out of the threat zone. Nor can security forces treat every casualty on scene during the initial stages of the attack. Responding forces have to win the fight before they can focus on treating victims. And any delays in winning the fight, it's only going to lead to more casualties. If you can't run for whatever reason, try to hide. Seek a room with limited doors, strong doors that'll lock the windows and doors, barricade the door, cover the windows, turn out the lights, make the room look as empty as possible, build barricades from desks or boxes of supplies, workbenches, what have you, against the door. Remain on the floor below any window lines, silence your phone, call any local emergency service. If you can't talk, leave the line open. So the response, the operator can at least hear what's going on around you. Use text messages or internet communications if you can, and remain in place until a known, some kind of known individual positively identifies him or herself as a responding security force official.
Thanks,
Sorry, that's a little long-winded, but.
Brendan, the next one's for you. How widespread have internet disruptions been, or are they likely to be?
So the internet disruptions so far have been very localized to areas in which disruptive protests or clashes between protesters and security forces have occurred. So far we've seen them, especially in the far northeast region, but today they were implemented briefly in parts of Delhi, and I believe we've also seen some in parts of West Bengal. So far this is a strategy, that authorities use a strategy quite frequently in India, but so far it has been highly localized, and in terms of where it has happened in large cities, it hasn't lasted for a prolonged period of time.
Thanks. The next question is also for you. Do you have an estimated time frame for notification of the CAA or a court decision about it?
So in terms of notification, the government can do this whenever they want. It's possible they'll do it 20 minutes from now. It's possible they'll do it in a week, a month, a year, 10 years. It's possible that they'll never do it. So really, that could happen without warning at any time, or it might not happen at all. And then in terms of a court decision, my understanding is it certainly won't happen before I believe late January 2020, obviously, and that would be the earliest time in which that might happen. But then it could happen also after that.
So what indications or developments would we be looking for to cancel or restrict travel, particularly in Delhi or Bangalore?
Ultimately, that decision is going to depend on organizational and individual risk tolerance and operational needs. What I would say is that in general, organizations operating in Delhi and Bangalore that have travelers to Delhi and Bangalore would most likely be looking at things like widespread violence, especially violence between rival groups. For example, things like major Hindu-Muslim clashes. And as I mentioned during the presentation, we have not seen that yet, but that would certainly be a trigger point that most organizations would want to keep an eye on. And I would say in general that would be, again, we haven't seen this yet, but that would be, there's a greater possibility of that happening in Delhi than in Bangalore. There have been some protests in Bangalore, but I have not seen any that have been especially disruptive or intense.
Do you have any resources for identifying likely flashpoints and protest locations in Delhi and Bangalore?
I absolutely do. There's an excellent resource, which is an alert that we published today about disruptive protests in Delhi. If you look at the map there, we have highlighted specific neighborhoods where we have seen major protests and where major protests are most likely. In terms of Bangalore, obviously we will alert that if and when it becomes enough of an issue. But I also think I believe we do have some standing intelligence on, popular protest locations in Bangalore.
Great, thank you. The next question we may need to do a follow-up on. Do we know of any clients that have enacted travel restrictions yet, and if so, what type?
So I haven't heard of that yet off the top of my head, but I think it is an issue that we definitely could look into and follow up on.
Yeah, as of there have been clients inquiring as to the availability of assets and resources on the ground. But as of the last, and keep in mind, this is a very dynamic situation, so a lot could have changed in the last 10 hours, but as of 10 hours ago, we haven't received, and WorldAware hasn't received any information, at least to my knowledge, from any clients that have implemented any kind of restrictions, any kind of travel restrictions. But I would imagine there's several that are currently evaluating their options, given the inquiries we have had as to the availability of assets, security assets and resources we have available for them.
One more quick note on that. I mean, I think it might be possible that some organizations have reassessed travel to specifically the far northeast of India, where these protests have been most intense and disruptive. But in terms of like India-wide travel restrictions, I don't believe I've seen that.
Thank you. The next question is also for you, Brendan. Do you have any prediction about the current Muslim-Hindu anger for significant religious violence and death, similar to what was seen in 1992 by Hindu activists?
Sure, with the Babri Masjid demolition. I would say at this point, this Citizenship Amendment Act is nowhere near as intense in terms of arousing generalized interreligious, well, I should say in terms of intensifying generalized interreligious anger in India. It's important to understand that, opposition to this act outside of the far northeast of India has been, for the most part, specifically intense amongst India's Muslim population. However, there are, many, as I said before, political opposition parties that are opposed to it. There have been many Hindus and other people of other religions who have protested against this act. So at this point, it is not, a dynamic of generalized, communal Hindu versus Muslim anger. Certainly not throughout the country. That being said, it is possible that, protests and potentially counter-protests could start to take that form, especially in parts of India where there already are generalized Hindu-Muslim tensions, like areas of Uttar Pradesh state specifically. But again, to answer the question, it has not been nearly as intense as those communal riots that we saw in 1992, or like the communal riots that occurred in Gujarat state in, I believe it was 2002.
Thanks, Brendan. If there are no other questions, we'll wrap up. Thank you, Brendan and Tony. And Thank you everyone for listening into our briefing. We'll be sending a follow-up email to all attendees with a link to view a recording of today's briefing. If you have any additional questions, you can contact us at customerservice@worldaware.com. On behalf of WorldAware and our presenters, have a great rest of your day.